What if the man sitting quietly in seat 14A, just another tired single dad on a commercial flight, was once the most feared and respected pilot in the U.S. Air Force? And what if, when disaster struck at 37,000 feet, he spoke just 4 words into the radio? That made 2 F-22 pilots freeze in midair. This is Ghost Rider. This is a story about second chances, hidden heroism, and the kind of courage that doesn't roar, but returns when it's needed most. If stories of redemption, family, and quiet strength move your heart, make sure to subscribe to Soul Moment Story for more powerful tales like this one. Now, let's begin. The sun was just beginning to lift over the Texas horizon, brushing gold across the windows of Flight 227, bound from Dallas to Los Angeles. Inside the aircraft, the usual hum of small talk, seatbelt clicks, and coffee orders filled the cabin. To anyone looking, it was just another flight, another morning, except for the man in seat 14A. Brandon Cole sat by the window, his profile calm but unreadable. The green flight jacket he wore looked too worn to be stylish, the kind only someone who'd earned it would keep. On his wrist, an old pilot's watch ticked steadily at scratched glass, whispering stories of skies most people would never see. He wasn't supposed to be here, at least not like this, flying inside a plane instead of commanding one. To the world, Brandon Cole was a quiet, middle-aged commercial pilot who'd recently changed airlines. To a handful of men and women in uniform, however, the name Ghost Rider still carried weight, spoken in whispers, followed by a pause. Because 10 years ago, Ghost Rider had vanished during a Black Ops air mission that never officially existed. His plane went down over hostile terrain. The military declared him dead. But he didn't die. He'd walked away from the wreckage and from everything else, his career, his medals, his identity. The war had taken too much. Now all he had left was a quiet life, a teenage son waiting for him in Los Angeles, and the sky above that still called to him every night. He stared out the window as the plane climbed to cruising altitude, the world below turning to cotton clouds. Somewhere behind him, laughter rose from a group of business travelers clinking their coffee cups. The seatbelt light went off. The intercom buzzed. Everything seemed normal. But Brandon's instincts were never fully asleep. Years of training had tuned his senses to catch what others missed: the shift in an engine's hum, the subtle pitch of airflow, the rhythm of metal and motion. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. And right now, something felt off. The left engine's vibration pattern was slightly irregular, a fractional imbalance that most would never notice. But to him, it was like hearing a heartbeat skip. He frowned slightly, tilting his head, listening. It steadied. Maybe just turbulence. He forced himself to relax, leaning back as the flight attendant rolled her cart down the aisle. "Coffee, sir?" she asked with a bright smile. He nodded, returning a polite one of his own. "Black, please." As she poured, a voice from the back caught his ear, steady, authoritative female. "Colonel, your seat's just here." He glanced discreetly over his shoulder. A woman in a dark green uniform was walking down the aisle, followed by 2 aides. Her presence drew quiet attention, poise, confidence, and that unmistakable air of command. On her chest glimmered ribbons and stars that spoke of decades in service. Brandon's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. He recognized the insignia. 4 stars. United States Air Force General. Her name tag read, Brooks. Diana Brooks. He looked away quickly before she could notice, but fate, as it often does, was already setting the board. As she took her seat several rows behind, Diana caught a glimpse of him, the quiet man in the faded pilot jacket. Something about the way he carried himself, straight-backed, yet unassuming, tugged at her memory. The world was small in the military, but not that small. She brushed it aside. After all, she'd attended hundreds of ceremonies, met thousands of pilots. And yet, as the plane leveled off, she found herself glancing his way again. There was something hauntingly familiar about his stillness. 30 minutes later, clouds rolled thick and white outside the windows. The captain's calm voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached 37,000 feet. Expect smooth air until Los Angeles, but smooth air like peace rarely lasted." It began with a faint thud, then another. The floor vibrated. A metallic groan rippled through the fuselage. Brandon's head snapped toward the window just in time to see a flash of orange flare from the left wing. Passengers gasped. Drinks spilled. The intercom crackled with static. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated." Then came the sound no one ever forgets. A deep, guttural boom. The entire aircraft lurched. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like pale ghosts. Screams erupted. The plane banked hard to the right. Brandon's body reacted before his mind did. Years of training surged forward, drowning out fear with precision. He ripped off his seatbelt, moved against the tilt, and steadied himself by gripping the seats as he made his way toward the cockpit. Sir, you can't go up there," a flight attendant shouted, her voice trembling. He turned his tone steady but sharp. "The pilot's injured. You'll lose this plane in under 5 minutes if someone doesn't take the controls." Her mouth fell open. How do you know that?" But he was already gone. Inside the cockpit, chaos reigned. Smoke filled the small space. The captain lay slumped, bleeding from a gash on his forehead. The co-pilot clutched his arm, pale and shaken. Warning lights blinked in every color. Brandon grabbed the headset, assessing faster than any civilian ever could. "Engine 1's gone. Hydraulics are failing. We've lost yaw control." The co-pilot blinked, startled. Who are you?" Brandon didn't answer. He sat in the captain's seat, hands moving across the console with the ease of muscle memory. His fingers hovered over the throttle levers like a pianist about to play a piece he'd written himself. For the first time in 10 years, his pulse slowed not from calm, but from clarity. He glanced at the radio, then without hesitation flipped it on. His voice came low, calm, and controlled. "This is Ghost Rider, requesting emergency escort. Mayday. Mayday." The words hit the frequency like a thunderclap. In the control tower, silence followed, then disbelief. Ghost Rider. That name hadn't been heard in a decade, and 30 miles away, 2 F-22 Raptors on training exercise caught the transmission. The pilot of one froze mid-sentence. "Say again, Tower." "Did you just say Ghost Rider?" Back in the cabin, passengers clung to their seats, praying, crying. Brandon's voice, though unseen, came through the PA system, calm and steady as stone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your pilot speaking. We've had an engine failure, but everything's under control. Keep your seatbelts fastened." Behind the cockpit door, the co-pilot watched him in stunned silence. The man's hands moved like he was born there, reading the aircraft's every breath. At row 17, General Diana Brooks sat frozen, her mind spinning. The voice through the intercom, low, measured, unshakably familiar, made her blood run cold. It couldn't be. Her hand trembled as she whispered the name she hadn't spoken in a decade. Brandon Cole. The cabin shook again. Outside, through the clouds, the faint silhouette of 2 fighter jets approached, fast, sharp, and purposeful. The hunt for Ghost Rider had just begun. The smell of scorched metal began to seep subtly through the cabin air. It wasn't immediate. At first, it was just a faint, acrid trace too light to trigger panic, but enough to raise the hackles on the neck of anyone who'd smelled burning hydraulic fluid before. Brandon Cole's eyes narrowed as he sat in the cockpit, his hands already steady on the controls. 10 years had passed since his last military flight. Yet in the span of 60 seconds, it all came rushing back. The way his breathing slowed, the tightening in his chest that wasn't fear, it was focus. A pilot's instinct, the kind you don't train, the kind you're born with. Behind him, the co-pilot groaned softly, trying to sit up. His arm was bleeding where the console had whipped sideways in the sudden jolt. The captain remained unconscious, his forehead bloodied his headset askew. Brandon glanced at the systems. Left engine failure, hydraulic pressure dropping fast, electrical bus fluctuating. He didn't need a diagnostic screen. The plane was bleeding out. Over the headset, static crackled. "This is LA Center to Flight 227. We're receiving Mayday signal. Please confirm nature of emergency." Brandon leaned in, voice crisp and level. "LA Center, this is Flight 227. Engine 1 failure. Loss of primary hydraulics. Captain incapacitated. I am assuming command authorization code, Mike Tango 37 Charlie." A long pause followed. Then slowly, "Roger, that Flight 227. Say again, who is the acting pilot?" He hesitated for half a second, then Ghost Rider. And just like that, the airwaves froze. 37,000 feet below, inside the LAX Regional Control Center, two senior technicians looked at each other. Their hands hovered above the keyboard. The supervisor, a gray-haired civilian named Rourke, turned pale. "Ghost Rider," he muttered. "No way. He's dead." "Sir," said a younger technician, eyes wide, "that call sign is restricted. I thought it was wiped from the system years ago." It was. Back in the air, the cabin was unraveling. People screamed. Some were praying. Others were calling loved ones on their phones, holding on to trembling children, or white-knuckling the seat in front of them. Flight attendants scrambled their training, colliding with instinct, trying to hold the chaos at bay. General Diana Brooks rose from her seat like a steel rod snapping into place. "Everyone stay calm," she commanded, her voice cutting cleanly through the panic. "Seatbelts on. Heads down. Breathe." The woman next to her sobbed. Diana reached over, clasped her hand tightly. Her eyes, however, never left the cockpit door. She knew that voice. She hadn't heard it in over a decade, but there was no mistaking it. It was deeper now, raspier maybe. But it carried the same quiet steel she remembered from that one night in Syria. The same voice that had said, "Hang on, ma'am. I'll get you out." A voice that had saved lives and disappeared. Brandon scanned the cockpit. The gauges weren't just screaming, they were dying. Systems were going dark one by one, like stars winking out. He switched to backup displays, rerouted power through the APU. Sloppy. Crude. But it worked. He flipped open a rarely used override cover and toggled a switch that only someone with combat flight experience would ever consider using thrust-only control mode. No flaps, no rudder, no elevator, nothing but raw engine thrust to steer. Impossible, they called it, unless you were Ghost Rider. 30 miles north, two F-22 Raptors had just intercepted the emergency transmission. Ghost Rider Latine Tyler Blaze. Donovan nearly dropped his oxygen mask, his wingman Carter Fangs. Miller glanced at him across the open channel. "Did he just say what I think he said?" "Yeah," Blaze said, voice low. "And if that's really him, we're flying in history." They banked hard and angled south toward the last known coordinates of Flight 227. Inside the cabin, passengers jolted as the aircraft shuddered again. A high-pitched alarm blared once, then died. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," came Brandon's voice, low, calm, unhurried. "We've experienced a critical failure on the left engine and lost control hydraulics. But we are still flying. I need you to remain calm, keep your seatbelts fastened, and trust the process. We are not going down today." The tone didn't command. It reassured. In row 17, General Brooks closed her eyes and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Back in the cockpit, Brandon ran a silent checklist. Forget the civilian protocols. This was now military logic, triage, stabilization, survival. First buy time, second signal help. Third, land this damn bird. His left hand nudged the throttle, gently adjusting asymmetric thrust to stabilize yaw. With no rudder, Every adjustment required predictive timing. He was flying on instinct by feel, like a musician playing a broken piano. The clouds cleared slightly ahead, and there, in the distant blue, two shapes emerged. Sleek, deadly, beautiful. Raptors. He exhaled. About damn time. He pressed the radio. F-22 flight. This is Ghost Rider Actual. We are crippled but maintaining altitude. Request escort and visual analysis of external damage. Blaze responded, breathless. Copy, Ghost Rider. We've got your 6. Visual in 10 seconds. Seconds later, the Raptors pulled up alongside the stricken 737-1 to the left wing 1 beneath the fuselage. Inside the F-22, Blaze's hands trembled slightly as he zoomed in. Engines toast. Left struts buckled. Hydraulic fluid spraying across the rear stabilizer. You've got scorched fuselage near the root, but it's holding, sir. Copy, Brandon said. Heading to Edwards. Full emergency protocol. Stay with me. General Brooks pushed past 2 attendants and reached the cockpit door. She knocked once, firm and clear. The door opened slightly. Brandon glanced back. Their eyes met. In a single breath, the past rushed in Syria. Smoke, a broken convoy, him dragging her out from a burning Humvee, his face half covered in soot and sweat. And then, nothing. A flag, a funeral, a classified folder. Now he was standing 5 feet from her, alive. Brandon, she whispered, voice breaking. You're not now, he said gently. You'll get your answers. But first I have to land this plane. She nodded, blinking fast. Understood. But you're not alone anymore. She stepped back, eyes glistening. A 4-star general, saluting a man in a scorched flight jacket. Brandon adjusted the pitch with millimetric taps on the throttle, watching the altimeter closely. They were losing altitude slowly but steady, enough to make landing a race against time. LA Center, he called. Diverting to Edwards Air Force Base. Prepare emergency cruise. The response came back quickly. Cleared to land. Runway. 21 left. Crews are mobilized. Godspeed, Ghost Rider. Brandon gave a small smile, the first in hours. Amen to that. He looked to the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip, casting warm gold across the battered wings. And he whispered to no one, "Come on, girl. Take me home one more time." The control stick didn't respond. Brandon Cole's fingers hovered just above it out of habit, though he knew better. Every tactile impulse his body wanted to send, rudder correction, trim, balance angle of approach, was useless now. The stick was dead. The plane was flying on nothing but throttle control and instinct. He wasn't flying the 737, he was persuading it. Steer with your breath, balance with your mind, he whispered to himself, a mantra taught by his first flight instructor at Nellis. Thrust as your brush paint your way home. A flicker of turbulence nudged the fuselage. Brandon compensated immediately, easing the starboard throttle by 1 degree, creating a micro pull that shifted the nose back toward centerline. No electronic aid, no flight computer, just feel, memory, control born of chaos. The radio lit up again. Ghost Rider. This is Blaze. You're drifting 2 degrees off glide. Rear stabilizers heating from residual fluid fire. Recommend you adjust port side thrust by 3.5%. Brandon didn't answer right away. He stared at the gauges at the faint, shimmering blur on the left camera feed, and then glanced out the cockpit window. Blaze was hovering to his left, the F-22's silver wings slicing through clouds like a surgeon's scalpel. 10 years. And yet here he was, flying again with Raptors at his wing. He eased the left throttle forward inch by inch. The plane responded with a soft groan, realigning like a wounded stallion, learning to trust its rider again. In the control room at Edwards Air Force Base, red alerts filled the screens. Technicians scrambled, phones rang, and at the center of it, all Colonel James Cutler, Airfield Commander, stood frozen, staring at the transmission log. A junior officer approached, hesitant. "Sir, Are we really hearing Ghost Rider? Cutler didn't answer immediately. He looked at the grainy screen showing the commercial aircraft escorted by 2 Raptors. I flew with him, once Cutler said quietly. He shouldn't be alive. But he is, sir. Cutler nodded once. Then prep, runway. 2-1 left. Full emergency protocol. And for God's sake, tell fire crews to stay clear until he gives the signal. You don't direct Ghost Rider, you clear the way. In the cabin, the mood had shifted. Terror had softened to awe. Dozens of passengers stared out the windows at the sleek fighter jets, pacing their aircraft, moving like guardian angels of war. Phones recorded lips, whispered prayers, and still, the voice from the cockpit remained calm, almost soothing. "This is your pilot speaking," Brandon said again. "We've adjusted course to land at Edwards Air Force Base. Flight crew will instruct you on emergency procedures. You'll be okay." In row 17, General Diana Brooks closed her eyes. Her mind retraced memories she had buried, deep memories of a younger version of herself, once full of fire leading tactical squadrons in dust-blown war zones. And a man who had once saved her with no more than a broken helicopter and sheer will. She had buried Brandon Cole with full honors. She had written letters to his family. She had saluted an empty casket, and now that same man was piloting a crippled jet with 132 souls on board, with the same fierce steadiness as before. Inside the F-22 cockpit, Blaze's heart pounded. He wasn't a rookie, he'd flown combat missions, logged hours in war zones. But this was different. His mentor, his legend, Ghost Rider. He keyed his mic. "Ghost Rider. This is Blaze. I trained under your flight doctrine at Red Flag 7 years ago. You taught us to land without control surfaces, but nobody ever managed it in simulation." There was a long pause. Then Brandon responded, voice dry but faintly amused. "I never liked simulations." Blaze let out a breathless laugh. "Roger that." Brandon toggled the comms back to Edwards Tower. Ghost Rider requesting final approach vector. "Ghost Rider. This is Edwards Tower. Runway. 2-1 left is clear. Winds out of the southwest at 8 knots. You are cleared for emergency landing. Emergency response teams on standby." He looked at the approach path. The descent would be fast, steep, and dangerously unbalanced, but it was the only shot. He tightened the seatbelt around his waist and muttered to himself, "Let's paint it one stroke at a time." He started the descent. As the plane nosed forward, Brandon trimmed the thrust, manually controlling roll, with only the barest differential between the twin engines. The airframe creaked and groaned in protest, but held. Altitude 14,000 feet, speed 230 knots, landing gear unresponsive. He tried again. Still nothing. The hydraulic failure had locked the gear. Behind him, the co-pilot whispered, "Gears jammed." Brandon nodded once. "I know. Do we belly land?" "Not if I can slam the backup release hard enough." He reached under the console, found the emergency gear drop lever, and pulled with everything he had. Clunk. Clunk. Thud. The cockpit shook. Blaze's voice rang through. "Gears down and locked." Copy, Brandon replied, beginning final flare. On the ground, Colonel Cutler watched through binoculars. The plane approached with a sharp angle lower than typical, too fast. "He's coming in hot," someone said. Cutler didn't blink. That's how Ghost Rider lands. The 737 roared in. Brandon flared as much as the compromised controls allowed. Tires met tarmac with a bone-jarring slam. One tire exploded. The right gear buckled but held. The plane skidded sideways, sparks flying as the brakes failed. Brandon yanked asymmetric throttle to pivot the jet straight. Smoke billowed behind them. Passengers screamed. But the aircraft didn't flip. It didn't break. It slid nearly 300 meters and stopped just 100 feet from the edge of the runway. Silence. And then, cheers. Tears. Applause. Laughter mixed with sobs. Brandon exhaled finally. His fingers trembled slightly as he shut down the throttles, cut the fuel valves, and powered off the main bus. The aircraft was still in one piece. So was he. The cockpit door opened. Diana Brooks stood there, unmoving, her uniform rumpled, her eyes wet. Brandon looked up at her. For a moment, neither said a word. Finally, she stepped forward and saluted. "Welcome back, Major Cole." He shook his head, slightly tired, but smiling. "I was never very good at staying buried." She returned the smile, voice thick with emotion. "No, you were good at surviving, and saving the rest of us in the process." He stood, and for the first time in 10 years, Brandon Cole stepped out of a cockpit, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as the man who had just brought a dead aircraft back to life. The roar of the engines faded as the 737 came to a trembling stop on the far edge of runway 21 left. For a moment, all was still. Smoke drifted skyward in lazy tendrils, silhouetted against the bleeding light of the setting sun. The only sounds inside the cabin were the soft clicks of passengers unbuckling seatbelts and the faint sobs of those who had just faced death and survived. Inside the cockpit, Brandon Cole sat quietly for a moment. Longer. Eyes closed. Not in prayer, not in exhaustion, just in reverence. Reverence for the machine that had held together, for the sky that had tested him, and for the silence that only came when the impossible had been done. Then he exhaled and stood. Overhead, 2 F-22 Raptors circled in tight formation, their sleek wings banking gently as they completed a final flyover. From above, the commercial jet looked like a wounded bird, scarred, scorched, but miraculously intact. Inside Blaze's cockpit, Lieutenant Tyler Donovan stared down through his canopy in disbelief. "You seeing this, Fangs?" He radioed, his voice low with awe. "Lieutenant Carter." Fangs Miller's voice came back equally stunned. He landed it, with no rudder, no elevator, and a blown gear. That's not flying, man. That's art." Blaze couldn't take his eyes off the scene below. The man in the pilot's seat was a ghost from the past, a legend from the red flag training manuals, a name whispered in Air Force lore like an urban myth until today. He thought back to his own training at Nellis. The instructors always started with the same story. There was once a pilot who flew a burning F-16 halfway across the Middle East on one engine and no nav. Landed it blindfolded in a sandstorm. His name, Ghost Rider. But don't bother looking him up. He's a ghost for a reason. They had all laughed at the story. Some rolled their eyes. But Blaze, he had believed. Something about it rang true. And now the man was real, alive, and flying better than any simulator had ever taught. In the tower at Edwards, the ground crew scrambled forward. Fire engines circled, maintaining distance until the all clear. Emergency slides deployed from the aircraft. Passengers began to descend, dazed but alive. Most were barefoot, clutching only their carry-ons or each other. And then came the moment everyone would remember. Brandon Cole stepped out. His green flight jacket was singed at the shoulder. A streak of oil stained one sleeve. His hair, once neat, had come slightly undone, fluttering in the wind. But he stood tall, calm eyes scanning the horizon, as if searching for something only he could see. The 2 F-22s dipped low in tandem, banking gracefully toward the base. Blaze watched the man emerge through the smoke and felt something shift in his chest. "I'm requesting permission to land," he said suddenly over the channel. "Copy that," Blaze Tower responded. "Cleared to land. Both Raptors." Blaze and Fangs descended together, lining up on the secondary runway. Their landing was smooth, almost ceremonial. As they taxied toward the emergency staging zone, Blaze kept glancing toward the crowd forming near the commercial plane. He couldn't explain why, but he had to meet him. The man who once trained his instructors. The man whose techniques had saved lives before drones ever existed. The man who had returned from the dead, not to reclaim glory, but to save 132 strangers on a plane he didn't even belong in. Brandon stood beside the aircraft, now watching passengers embrace, cry, or drop to their knees in disbelief. A young boy ran up and hugged his legs. An older woman touched his face, as if to confirm he was real. He accepted it all quietly, graciously. But his eyes scanned beyond the crowd toward the two Raptors now parked in the distance. And then he saw them. Two pilots in full flight gear walking toward him across the tarmac. One young, one younger. Blaze removed his helmet as he approached, revealing short brown hair and eyes wide with disbelief. "Sir," he said, voice shaky. "Lieutenant Tyler Donovan, call sign Blaze." Brandon gave a small nod. "You flew tight. Good throttle balance on the left side. Kept me level when she started to yaw out." Blaze blinked. You noticed that?" "Of course I did," Brandon replied with a faint grin. "You don't forget how to read a wingman." Fang stepped forward. "Sir, if I may ask, how the hell did you pull that off?" Brandon chuckled. With a little thrust, a lot of luck, and one very angry airplane. The pilots laughed, but there was reverence behind it. They didn't just see a man, they saw a myth breathing again. Blaze grew serious. "Sir, when I was a cadet, they told us about Ghost Rider. Said you were the best there ever was. That you disappeared in a mission gone wrong. But I never believed you were gone." Brandon looked at him, the wind brushing through his hair. "I wasn't gone, Lieutenant. Just grounded." Blaze saluted. Fangs followed. Brandon hesitated, then returned the salute slow and steady. No fanfare, no speeches. Just the silent exchange of men who understood what it meant to fly to fall and to rise again. From behind, a familiar voice called out, "Brandon." He turned to see General Diana Brooks approaching the crowd, parting around her, as if pushed by unseen hands. She was no longer the officer keeping calm in crisis. Her eyes were filled with questions, memories, and a flicker of something even deeper. She stopped a few feet away. "I watched your plane drop below radar 10 years ago," she said softly. "I signed the papers. I saluted the flag. And yet you're here, standing." Brandon's smile faded. "I didn't plan it that way. After the crash, I was injured, lost comms. The op was classified. No extraction. I crawled out, went off-grid. It was easier to let them believe I was gone." Diana studied him for a long beat. "And why now? Why come back today?" He looked past her to the crowd, to the aircraft still steaming in the distance. "I didn't come back, Diana. I was just on a flight home." She stepped forward, voice dropping. "You didn't just land a plane. You resurrected a legend. And a part of me, too." He met her eyes, and for a moment the weight of the past slipped away. Above them, the last rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds. The air smelled of jet fuel and redemption. On the runway, a silent understanding passed between pilots, young and old, ghosts and living. The man once thought dead had flown again, not to chase glory, but to bring everyone else home. The setting sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, stretching the figures of soldiers, firefighters, medics, and rescued passengers into silhouettes that seemed suspended in time. Amid the soft hum of emergency generators and distant chatter from news crews just arriving, Brandon Cole stood silently, his breath shallow, his pulse finally beginning to slow. For 10 years he had outrun his past. Today it had found him, but not with punishment, with purpose. Across from him stood General Diana Brooks. Her face, always composed in public, now held the fragile tension of a dam ready to break. Her uniform bore 4 stars on the collar, But her eyes, those familiar, sharp, impossibly human eyes, were locked onto Brandon, like she was seeing a ghost and a miracle at the same time. "You should be dead," she said softly, a sad smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I tried." Brandon replied, his voice dry but honest. "Didn't stick." There was a beat of silence. Then, just as before, it was Diana who moved first. Always the one who stepped forward, never back. She reached out and placed her hand gently on the sleeve of his worn flight jacket. "You saved my entire team in Syria," she said. "Dragged me out of a burning convoy while under fire. You didn't hesitate then. You didn't hesitate today." Why, Brandon looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because I still could." Her hand didn't move. "You didn't have to. That wasn't your plane. That wasn't your job. You could have stayed in your seat like any other passenger." "I'm not like any other passenger," he said, turning back to meet her gaze. "And you know it." She nodded slowly. For a moment, the world fell away. It was just the two of them, surrounded by the afterglow of crisis and the echoes of a connection never fully acknowledged until now. Paramedics moved through the crowd, checking on passengers. Reporters whispered frantically into cameras, trying to piece together the headline they could barely believe. "Veteran pilot saves 737 with no flight controls. Call sign ghostwriter." But Brandon remained untouched by it all. The only crowd he truly felt was the one inside him. Memories, regrets, fragments of a life he had chosen to bury for a decade. "I read your name on a marble wall," Diana said, her voice almost breaking. "Your body was never recovered, so they carved your legacy into stone. I visited it once a year, told myself it was just a way to honor your sacrifice. But I think I just missed you." Brandon looked down, voice quiet. "I missed you too. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. It was something deeper, earned in combat, tempered by silence, and now resurrected alongside him. I wanted to find you," she continued. "After the war, after the reports. I even sent someone to check the crash site. But you were gone. No trace. I was alive," he said. "Barely. But by the time I made it out of enemy territory, I realized something. I was tired. Not just in my bones, in my soul. I didn't want medals. I didn't want questions. I just wanted to be a father." Diana's eyes softened. "Your son?" Brandon nodded. "Ben. He was 4 when I vanished. He's 14 now. Lives with his aunt in Los Angeles. I've kept my distance. But I fly commercial just to see him for holidays. It's the only place I can still be close to the sky without anyone asking questions." Diana was silent for a moment. Then she said something Brandon didn't expect. "You saved 132 lives today. But you also saved me." He raised an eyebrow. "You didn't need saving. You're a 4-star general." "I mean it," she said firmly. "Do you have any idea what it does to a person to carry the weight of someone else's sacrifice? I built my career after Syria, thinking I owed everything to a man who died for me. But now I realize you didn't die for me. You lived. And that means I still have something to fight for." Her hand fell to her side, clenched now. "I don't know what happens next, Brandon. I don't know if you're going to vanish again. But I do know this today wasn't just a miracle. It was a message." Brandon tilted his head. "From who?" She smiled faintly. "From the sky. It gave me back a man I wasn't ready to lose." Behind them, passengers lined up to thank him. Some hugged him. Others cried in his arms. A teenage girl handed him a drawing she made on a crumpled napkin, a stick figure with wings, and the words, "Thank you, Mr. Pilot," written in pink marker. He took it with both hands, treating it like a medal. "Brandon Cole," a voice called out. It was a military liaison officer jog-walking toward them with a clipboard in hand. "Sir, the Pentagon is requesting immediate debrief. Press is flooding social media. Air Force Command is asking if you'll agree to a public statement. Brandon looked at Diana, then back at the officer. Not yet, he said. Not tonight. The officer blinked. Sir, I'm not done flying today, he said. Then with a weary smile, he added, There's a kid in Los Angeles waiting for his father. A few hours later, Diana found him sitting alone on a folding chair near the edge of the runway, away from the crowds. The air had cooled. The moon now peeked from behind scattered clouds. She sat beside him without saying a word. They just sat. Two warriors, two lives lived on borrowed time. You ever think Brandon said that we weren't supposed to survive? Diana shook her head. No, I think we were supposed to suffer, so that when we finally found peace, we'd understand its worth. He turned to her. You think peace is possible for people like us? She smiled. Not if you keep running. Brandon laughed softly. I'm too tired to run anymore. Then stop running, she said. Start landing. A long silence followed. Finally, Brandon reached into his jacket and pulled out something he hadn't touched in years, a silver dog tag scorched and bent. He handed it to her. She took it gently, her thumb brushing over the name, Cole Brandon. Ghostwriter. I want my son to know who I really was, he said, and who I am. You'll tell him, Brandon nodded. I think it's time. And in that quiet healing space between dusk and dawn, with the air smelling faintly of fuel and something sacred, Brandon Cole, the man who came back from the dead, began for the first time in a decade to land not just a plane, but his life. The first morning light rolled in like a soft tide across the tarmac of Edwards Air Force Base, washing away the scars of the night before. Emergency vehicles had been cleared. The wrecked Boeing 737 now sat quietly at the edge of the runway, wrapped in yellow tape and surrounded by silent technicians documenting the impossible. But the real story, the one no camera could fully capture, was still unfolding in the quiet corners of the base. Inside a makeshift debriefing room, Brandon Cole stood alone, staring at the wall. Projected on the screen in front of him was a 3D rendering of the 737's final flight path. The red arcs showed instability, altitude loss, directional drift. The green overlay showed the aircraft's final alignment with the runway. The vectors didn't make sense. You should have lost control 80 nautical miles out, said a voice behind him. Brandon didn't turn. I almost did. General Diana Brooks stepped into the room, her heels silent against the concrete floor. The report says the left stabilizer was held together with melted rivets. She continued. Flight control software was non-functional. No hydraulics. One working engine. But you still managed to land her. Brandon finally turned. Not by myself. Diana raised an eyebrow. The F-22 pilots confirmed they assisted with alignment and visuals. But you had no mechanical link to your rudder or elevators. You flew a 200,000-pound plane with thrust only. That's not just improbable. It's impossible. Brandon finished for her with a tired smile. I know. I've heard that before. She approached, setting a thick file folder on the table. This is the full systems log. I reviewed it with a Pentagon flight analyst this morning. The computer thought the plane was already in free fall by the time you made your radio call. Almost was. Diana's voice dropped. Then why didn't you say Mayday? Sooner Brandon looked down at the call log on the screen. The exact moment echoed again. This is Ghostwriter, requesting emergency escort. That was it. No panic, no formal Mayday protocol, just a declaration. And a name. Brandon reached forward and shut off the projector. The room fell into quiet. I didn't say Mayday, he said slowly, because I wasn't just trying to survive. Diana frowned. Then what were you doing? I was making a promise. She waited. He continued, his voice barely above a whisper. To my son, to myself, to the air itself. I wasn't going to die screaming, not again. If I was going to go down, I was going to fly her all the way in. Quiet, controlled, and with honor. Diana stepped closer. And when you didn't go down, he looked at her. I realized I still had something left to give. In another building on base, 2 men in black suits sat in front of a screen showing thermal footage of the 737's descent. Beside them, a Department of Defense liaison typed notes rapidly. One of the men, older, square-jawed with a CIA pin barely visible, leaned forward. "He's back." The other man nodded grimly. "The world's going to want to know why he disappeared. Not if we don't let them. We can't bury this. Not anymore." The older man paused. "We won't bury it, but we can control it. Ghost Rider didn't just survive, he saved lives in a way no one else could. And people will want to know why. So here's what we'll do." He reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope with a red wax seal. "Deliver this to General Brooks. Tell her it's from Command Echo. She'll know what that means." Meanwhile, Brandon walked the perimeter of the now empty runway. He wasn't required to. No one had asked him to. But something about standing at the edge of the place where it had all nearly ended felt necessary. A mechanic passed him, nodded, then turned back. "Sir." Brandon stopped. "Yeah," the young man looked sheepish. "I just wanted to say what you did up there. It reminded me why I joined. Not for war, but for people who don't quit when it's hopeless." Brandon smiled. "Then you're in the right place." The mechanic hesitated. "Were you really Ghost Rider? The one from Red Flag? The guy from the story with the sandstorm and the blind landing?" Brandon gave him a wink. Stories grow in the telling. "But yeah, I flew through a lot of sand." The mechanic laughed, then saluted. Brandon returned it casually and kept walking. Later that afternoon, Diana Brooks stood in her temporary office, the sealed envelope on her desk. She hadn't opened it yet. She recognized the seal immediately. Command Echo, a deep black strategic wing of the Department of Defense, known only to a handful of generals and certain retired assets. Brandon sat across from her, freshly showered, a clean shirt under his old flight jacket. The scars on his knuckles were more visible now. They looked like old fault lines, proof he had once held on when everything tried to throw him off course. She tapped the envelope. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. "I can guess. They want you back. Not as a pilot. As something more permanent." Brandon leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "I'm not the man I was 10 years ago, Diana." She shook her head. "No. You're better." He gave a soft chuckle. "Don't romanticize it." "I'm not. You were a legend. Now you're real. And that's more powerful than myth." Brandon looked toward the window, where beyond the airfield, a new set of reporters had gathered. "I didn't come back to wear a uniform again," he said. "I came back to make peace with the sky." Diana walked over and placed the envelope in his hand. "Then make peace with it. But don't think you can walk away from what you did yesterday. People need to see that the man in the myth has heart. And that sometimes a mayday call doesn't sound like a scream, it sounds like someone choosing to fight when no one else can." He looked down at the envelope, then up at her. "Is that an order for him?" She smiled. "It's a request from a friend." That evening, Brandon stood before a small crowd of base personnel, pilots, and survivors in a closed-air hangar. He had refused a press conference. No cameras, no live streams, just people who had been part of the story. He looked out over them, his voice calm but resolute. "I didn't expect to be here today. And if I'm honest, I didn't want to be. For a long time, I thought silence was the safest way to honor the things I'd lost." He paused. "But yesterday, when the sky tried to take another piece of me, I didn't feel fear. I felt a promise that maybe it's not too late to come home. There was no applause, just the kind of silence that follows a truth too heavy for noise. And in that silence, Brandon felt something he hadn't in years. Not weight, not burden. Purpose. The desert wind swept low across the cracked tarmac, lifting fine red dust into the air, like memories unearthed. At Edwards Air Force Base, the sky above was a cloudless blue, expansive and unforgiving. The kind of sky that offered no promises, only truth. Brandon Cole stood alone on a training runway far from the public eye. No cameras, no reporters, no fanfare. Just a man and a machine. Parked 20 yards away was a decommissioned F-16, a bird long retired from combat, but still flight-worthy under simulation controls. Next to it, a row of laptops and telemetry monitors sat shaded beneath a makeshift awning, manned by a half-dozen techs, and one weathered flight instructor with the posture of someone who'd seen too many combat dropouts and too few legends. "Ghost Rider," the instructor called out. "You sure about this?" Brandon didn't answer right away. He walked up to the F-16 and ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling every dent, every scar of its long life. Like his own. No flight assist, no autopilot, no digital rudder stabilizer, the instructor added. "This thing's as manual as it gets. That sim rig in there, it's gonna fight you every inch." Brandon looked at him. "Good. I want to remember what it's like to earn the sky again." Back at the operations center, General Diana Brooks watched the prep unfold via live feed. She stood in front of a large screen showing Brandon's vitals telemetry inputs and cockpit camera. Behind her, the Command Echo liaison agent Keller reviewed a tablet while sipping burnt coffee. "This isn't necessary," Keller muttered. "He's already proved he can fly." Why put him back in the cockpit? Diana's arms were folded. Her jaw was set. "Because for Brandon," she said quietly, "flying isn't a skill. It's a language. He hasn't spoken it in a decade. This isn't about proving something to us. It's about remembering something in him." Keller smirked. "Sounds poetic." "It's not," she said. "It's survival." Inside the F-16 cockpit, Brandon strapped in each click of the harness, anchoring him back into a version of himself he hadn't worn in 10 years. The interior smelled like old leather jet fuel and adrenaline. A scent burned into his DNA. He adjusted the throttle quadrant, flicked the battery switch, and began the pre-check sequence. The HUD blinked to life, primitive compared to modern Raptors, but familiar like the face of an old friend. "Ground this as Ghost Rider. Requesting clearance for simulation run throttle test only. Ghost Rider, you are cleared. Run as long as you like. Telemetry locked in." Brandon smiled faintly. "Let's see if these old wings still know the rhythm." The engine rumbled to life. The air around the cockpit shimmered with heat. The F-16 didn't just start, it woke up. As the fighter rolled slowly forward, Brandon eased the throttle, watching the horizon narrow into a line. Every vibration in the airframe pulsed through his spine. He could feel the plane not as metal, but as a living thing. No autopilot, no fly-by-wire. Just you and the laws of physics. At 120 knots, the nose lifted. The ground fell away. And for the first time in a decade, Brandon Cole left the Earth under his own hands. Diana watched the liftoff from the screen heart lodged somewhere between pride and fear. Agent Keller looked over the numbers, brow furrowed. "He's pushing the frame too hard. Why the hell is he banking already?" Diana didn't flinch. "He's not testing the plane." "Then what's he doing?" She stared at the screen as the F-16 executed a perfect 45-degree climb angle. Sharp thrust, throttled just enough to maintain balance without flaring. He's testing himself. In the sky, Brandon turned the jet into the wind, rolled once and leveled. He reached out not with hands, but with memory. With instinct. "Steer with your breath." He inhaled slowly, easing the rudder trim. balance with your mind. He banked into a controlled stall, held it, then recovered like water finding level. Thrust is your brush. He opened throttle and arced a tight loop across the sky, painting a circle above the desert floor. At that moment, Brandon was no longer 44 years old. He wasn't a grounded veteran, a forgotten hero, or a ghost. He was simply a pilot. His mind drifted not to war, but to the voice of his first instructor, Captain Miles Rourke, a legend at Nellis AFB who had trained 3 generations of combat aviators. Brandon could still hear him, like he was in the back seat. Your hands fly the plane, son, but your heart lands it. As he descended toward simulated landing, Brandon cut throttle halfway. Crosswinds tugged at the wings. He adjusted with pressure, not force, slight toe movements, micro-thrust corrections. The plane responded like it remembered him too. Wheels kissed the runway. No screech, no bounce, just grace. As Brandon taxied to a stop, a deep quiet settled over the telemetry room. Diana let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Keller stood arms crossed. He's not flying on muscle memory. That was reflex, like the jet was an extension of him. She nodded. Now you understand. What do we do with him? Diana looked at the screen where Brandon sat alone in the cockpit helmet, off face lifted toward the sun. We don't do anything to him, she said. We ask him what he wants to do next. Later, Brandon sat under the shade of a small observation platform near the edge of the runway, sipping water and watching another jet take off in the distance. Diana joined him, her dress blues sharp under the desert light. You flew that F-16 like it was born for you, she said. It was, he replied, not looking away from the sky. I used to say flying was the only time I felt honest. And now he turned to her. Now I feel ready. For what? He paused. To stop hiding. Diana handed him a small envelope. No seal, no markings. Inside was a photograph. Grainy, black and white. A boy standing next to a much younger Brandon in uniform. His son, Ben. He's in Los Angeles. Local baseball team. STEM student. Smart from what I've read. Brandon's throat tightened. I've missed everything, he whispered. Diana touched his hand. No. You survived everything. Now go be his father. He looked at her eyes glinting with something between fear and gratitude. Come with me, he asked softly. She smiled. Not this time. You've got one more flight left to make. Just you. As the sun began to fall over the Mojave, Brandon looked up at the sky once more. He wasn't afraid of it now, because this time he wasn't running from it. He was flying toward something. The desert light turned amber as the afternoon faded into a quiet, windless dusk. From above, the cracked runways of Edwards Air Force Base looked like faded scars, stitched lines in the sand, where steel birds had soared, crashed, and sometimes been reborn. Brandon Cole sat inside the cockpit of a Boeing 737 once again, but this time the aircraft wasn't roaring through the sky. It was parked alone on a maintenance runway, nose angled toward the western horizon. The same bird he had landed days before, crippled, scorched, wounded, was now tethered to the ground like a resting beast. He sat in silence, hands resting gently on the yoke. His eyes weren't on the instrument panel. They were distant, focused on something only he could see. Footsteps approached from the tarmac. You know it's not going anywhere, said General Diana Brooks from below. Brandon smiled without turning. Neither am I, just yet. She climbed the portable stairs and stepped into the cockpit. For a moment she stood beside him in silence, watching the sunlight spill across the scratched windshield. It's funny, Brandon said softly, how different everything feels when you're flying toward something instead of away. Diana eased into the co-pilot's seat, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. You've always had the instincts of a fighter pilot, but now you're flying like a father." He nodded slowly. "That's because for the first time I actually want to land." Earlier that morning, Diana had arranged a closed-door meeting in Hangar 6. Present were several officials from Command Echo Senior Air Force advisors and 2 legal counsel officers. Brandon had walked into the room not as a suspect, not even as a soldier, but as something more complicated. A man with a past no longer buried. "We're not here to question your heroism," one of the advisors had said. That was on full display. "What we need to understand," said another, "is what you want next. Because right now, Ghost Rider is no longer a ghost. He's a headline. And America's watching." Brandon had listened silent. Then he'd stood up, placed his call sign patch on the table, and said, "I didn't come back for medals. I came back because 132 people needed someone who didn't give up." A quiet settled over the room. "I won't be your poster," he said. "But I won't disappear again either." And with that, the meeting had ended. No press release, no interview, just a nod, and the quiet understanding between warriors. Now sitting beside Diana in the still cockpit, Brandon tapped a switch. The overhead panel blinked once, life returning to the dead systems. "They wanted to scrap this bird," he said. Said it wasn't worth salvaging. Too much structural compromise. She arched an eyebrow. "And you disagreed." I said maybe it wasn't ready to be scrapped. Maybe it just needed to be flown differently. Diana looked at him, her voice soft. "Are you talking about the plane or yourself?" He smiled, then leaned forward and pulled out a worn flight logbook from the storage compartment. He opened it to a blank page. Slowly, deliberately, he began to write. "Flight log entry 011, aircraft ID, civilian 737, tail number 227, pilot Brandon Cole, Ghost Rider notes. Hydraulics failed. Controls lost. 132 lives aboard. Landed safely. Sky intact. Pilot reborn." He tore the page out and handed it to Diana. "For the records," he said. "But not for the headlines." She folded the page and slipped it into her breast pocket. A knock sounded on the side of the plane. A ground crew member stepped in halfway up the stairs. "Sir, ma'am, your ride is ready." Brandon and Diana stood. As they exited the aircraft, the last rays of sunlight shimmered across the tarmac. Waiting for them near the base perimeter was a black SUV. But parked behind it, gleaming under floodlights, was something else entirely. An Air Force VIP transport jet, engines warm, nose painted with a white hawk. Diana glanced at him. "They gave us clearance, non-stop to Los Angeles." Brandon squinted. "Us." She smiled. "Command Echo assigned me to personally oversee your reintegration." He laughed under his breath. "That sounds dangerously close to a promotion." "It's not," she said. "It's a reunion." The flight was short, barely an hour, but to Brandon, it felt longer than any combat mission he'd flown. His hand remained curled tightly around a small photograph Diana had slipped him earlier. His son, Ben, standing on a baseball field, in his team uniform glove in one hand, mouth open, mid-laugh. The caption on the back read, "Third base, undefeated season." For a man who had once calculated airspeed from shadow movement in a sandstorm, Brandon found himself uncharacteristically uncertain about how to approach a teenage boy who had grown up without him. Diana watched him from across the aisle. "You've fought gravity. You've flown broken birds. This is just a conversation." He met her gaze. "It's more than that." "Then it's worth it." They touched down at a private airfield on the outskirts of Los Angeles as evening swept across the city skyline. A car waited. No fanfare. No honor guard. Just a chance. And that was all Brandon needed. They pulled up in front of a modest suburban home. Porch light glowing. Lawn mowed. Wind chimes dancing softly in the breeze. Brandon stepped out first. His legs felt heavier than they had landing a disabled aircraft. He took a breath and walked toward the door. He knocked. Footsteps inside. Then the door opened. A boy, tall, lean, with his father's eyes, stood in the doorway, a baseball cap turned backward on his head. For a moment, neither moved. Then Brandon said quietly, "Hey, kid. I'm Brandon." The boy blinked. "I know." Brandon swallowed. "I wasn't there. I should have been." Ben stepped forward, still staring. Then, without a word, he threw his arms around his father. Brandon staggered slightly, then held him tightly, burying his face into the shoulder of a boy who shouldn't have had to grow up alone. Diana watched from the car, tears silently tracing her cheek, and across the sky, a single Raptor jet streaked through the clouds in a training loop, leaving behind only a white contrail. A reminder that even when a bird falls from the sky, sometimes it finds a way to fly again. The morning air at Edwards Air Force Base was crisp and strangely still, as if the desert itself had paused to remember. Runway 21 left was quiet now. The scorched rubber streaks from the emergency landing had faded beneath a fresh coat of tar. The twisted fragments of metal once embedded in the tarmac had been cleared, but something invisible remained in the air, like the ghost of a moment, too profound to fully vanish. In the center of the cleared runway stood Brandon Cole, alone. Wearing his old flight jacket now patched at the shoulder, he faced east, where the first rays of sun pierced the horizon. His posture was straight, shoulders squared, hands behind his back, not in parade rest, but in silent reflection. The rumble of approaching engines broke the stillness. 2 F-22 Raptors rolled onto the taxiway and stopped 100 yards behind him. Their canopies lifted in perfect unison. Out stepped Lieutenants Tyler Blaze, Donovan, and Carter Fangs. Miller still in flight suits, boots crunching against the concrete as they approached. They said nothing. They didn't need to. When they reached him, both pilots stood to his left and right, forming a perfect line. Facing forward, chins high, backs straight. Together they waited. A moment later, the hangar doors creaked open at the far end of the base. A long, sleek black SUV emerged slowly, its headlights off, moving at a solemn pace toward the line of men. Inside sat General Diana Brooks, flanked by 2 high-ranking officers and a man in civilian clothes. Secretary of the Air Force, no less. No cameras, no press. This wasn't a ceremony. This was a reckoning. The SUV stopped 10 feet away. Diana was the first to exit. She didn't wear her dress blues today, just her tan service uniform, crisp and without medals. Her expression was calm, but her eyes shimmered under the sunlight. She walked toward Brandon and stopped in front of him. The two had exchanged countless words since that harrowing flight, but today, in this sacred space, there was no room for conversation. Instead, she raised her hand. A slow, deliberate salute. Brandon hesitated, then returned it, sharp, steady. Behind her, Blaze and Fangs did the same. The Secretary of the Air Force remained silent. Then, in a motion so rare it would never be quoted in any official record, he placed his hand over his heart. This was not about protocol. This was about respect. After a long moment, Diana stepped forward and held something out. A ribboned case, deep blue with a golden crest. "I know you didn't ask for this," she said softly. "But this time, it's not about asking." She opened it. Inside lay the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest honors an aviator could receive. But next to it sat something even rarer, a small silver medallion etched with a falcon, mid-flight, a symbol reserved only for pilots who had redefined the very nature of flying. Only 5 had ever been given. Brandon stared at the medallion. Then softly, "I don't need this." Diana nodded. "No, but others need you to have it." He looked up. "Why? Because stories fade. Headlines pass, but symbols, they stay. And someday, a young cadet will walk past your photo on a wall and remember what a man can do when everything says it's over. Brandon reached forward and accepted the case not for himself, but for the sky that had once broken him and now somehow healed him. He turned and faced the raptors behind him, the same birds that had flanked him through fire and wind. Blaze stepped forward. "I asked command for one last flyby, sir," he said. They approved. Brandon blinked. Flyby Fangs nodded. Missing man formation. They wanted to honor the pilot who returned. But also, the one who never really left. Brandon's voice caught in his throat. He looked at Diana. She said nothing, just nodded gently. 10 minutes later, the base quieted again. All eyes turned upward. 4 F-22 Raptors soared into view, engines roaring across the desert like thunder from the heavens. They flew in diamond formation, tight, disciplined, flawless. And then, just as they passed overhead, one of the jets' blazes pulled sharply upward, straight into the sky, climbing alone, peeling away from the others in a steep vertical line. The missing man. Brandon removed his cap and stood tall. He felt something rise in his chest, something wordless. Not grief, not pride, release. The moment stretched like a hymn. As Blaze disappeared into the sun, the other 3 raptors held course, continuing their flight in silence. Diana moved beside Brandon, speaking softly. "Do you know why we do the missing man formation?" He nodded. "To honor the fallen." She turned to him. "Or the one who refused to fall." Later that afternoon, Brandon returned to the edge of the airfield, where his old jacket hung on a hook beside a rusted maintenance shed. He stood with his hands in his pockets, watching a young class of flight cadets take instruction near a simulator hangar. They were fresh-faced, excited, unaware of how close the edge of the sky really was. Diana appeared beside him, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. "You know, she said you could teach again. Mentor. Inspire. You don't have to fly solo anymore." Brandon smiled as he took the coffee. "I don't think I ever flew solo," he said quietly. "Not really." She looked at him. "You'll see Ben again soon," Brandon nodded. "Next week, his baseball game. He asked if I could stay for the whole weekend." Her smile deepened, and I said yes. "Good." They stood together in silence. Then Diana added, almost teasing, "You know, for a man who used to vanish without a trace, you've become surprisingly present." He chuckled. "Turns out dying doesn't teach you as much as surviving does." And as the sun dipped low again over the Mojave painting, the airfield gold, Brandon looked toward the runway one last time, not as a pilot chasing escape, but as a man who had landed finally where he was meant to be. Washington, D.C. had never felt farther from the desert skies. Under the vaulted glass ceiling of the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, an intimate ceremony was unfolding, one that had not been announced to the public, yet was attended by generals, war heroes, scholars, and a scattering of civilians whose lives had been changed by a quiet man who had never wanted the spotlight. Brandon Cole stood near the base of a raised platform in his freshly pressed dress uniform. Not the one issued years ago when he was still enlisted. This one was new, tailored for the occasion. But beneath its fine fabric, he was still the same man who had once disappeared into the smoke of a failed mission and reemerged 10 years later to fly a crippled jet to safety. Around him, the hangar-sized hall echoed with a quiet reverence. Above, a suspended SR-71 Blackbird loomed like a shadow from the Cold War. Nearby, a projection screen cycled through real-time images of Flight 227's data telemetry, the dive, the radio, call the impossible glide. But the air held more than celebration. It held vindication. And more than that, it held meaning. At precisely 10:00 a.m., General Diana Brooks approached the podium. No notes, no teleprompter. Just the stillness of a woman who had flown through war, climbed through ranks, and stood beside ghosts without flinching. She cleared her throat, her voice echoing across the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered not simply to bestow a medal, but to acknowledge a moment. A moment where experience met instinct. Where a man long presumed lost chose not to stay hidden. And in doing so, he gave us all something we didn't know we had lost faith. A murmur of agreement moved through the crowd, like wind through wheat. Brooks continued, her eyes fixed on Brandon. Major Brandon Cole, call sign Ghost Rider, did not volunteer to be a symbol. He did not return for glory. He returned because people needed him. And in answering that need, he reminded every one of us, military or civilian, that courage doesn't roar. Sometimes, it whispers in the cockpit when everything is falling apart. Brandon shifted slightly, hands folded behind his back. Not out of discomfort, but out of humility. His chest did not puff, his chin did not rise. He simply stood. Brooks stepped down, walked toward him, and reached into a black velvet case. "The President of the United States," she said upon recommendation from the Secretary of Defense and Command, "Echo has awarded Major Brandon Cole the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor for extraordinary heroism in aerial flight." She pinned the medal to his chest, her hand steady despite the lump in her throat. Brandon saluted. Brooks returned it, her voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. "You earned this long before anyone saw you again." There was polite applause. And then, silence. Everyone expected Brandon to shake a few hands, smile for photos, and quietly fade to the edge of the event. But instead, he stepped forward, to the podium, and the room stilled again. He looked out over the crowd, not searching for recognition, but connection. And then he spoke. No ceremony, no script, just truth. "When I first learned to fly," he began, "my instructor told me that flying wasn't about defeating gravity. It was about surrendering to it, understanding it. That fear wasn't something to fight, but something to listen to." He paused. "And when I vanished, when I walked away from everything I did, it not because I was afraid of dying. I did it because I was afraid of being remembered as only what I had lost." People leaned in. Some held their breath. But then he continued, 37,000 feet in the air, with one engine, no hydraulics, and a plane full of strangers. I heard a different voice inside me, not the ghost of a soldier, but the father in me, the human, and he didn't want to vanish. Brandon's gaze moved slowly across the crowd. "You don't need wings to fly," he said. "You don't need medals to matter. Sometimes all it takes is showing up when no one else will. Sitting in the empty chair, answering the call even if your hands shake when you lift the phone." He cleared his throat. "So if there's one thing I hope people remember from all this, it's that your past doesn't get to define the size of your future. You can come back, even from the dead." There was no applause yet, just stunned stillness. Then finally, a rising wave of claps, then cheers, not loud and celebratory, but deep and full of something rare. Gratitude. Later, as the museum slowly emptied, Diana joined Brandon beneath the wing of the Blackbird. "You've become a better speaker," she teased gently. He smirked. "I was just thinking the same about you." She held up her phone. "Your speech is already trending on veterans' networks. They're calling you the pilot prophet." He winced. "Please no." She chuckled. Too late. They stood quietly gazing at the medal still resting against Brandon's chest. He finally broke the silence. "It feels heavy." "That's how you know it's real," she replied. He looked at her. You think it'll last? The attention, the purpose, the peace. Diana met his eyes. No, not all of it. But the people you touched, the ones who saw you land that plane, who heard your voice, who sat in that cabin and watched hope take the controls, they'll carry this longer than you know. She leaned in, voice warm. And so will Ben. That evening, Brandon boarded a civilian flight to Los Angeles. No press, no escorts. Just a quiet window seat and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. A young mother beside him struggled with her toddler, apologizing for the noise. Brandon smiled gently, pulled a small plastic toy from his bag, a little die-cast jet, and handed it to the boy. The child lit up. The mother blinked, recognizing the man from the news. Are you? Brandon nodded once. I'm a pilot, he said softly. But mostly I'm just someone trying to get home. She smiled, suddenly teary. Aren't we all? Brandon looked out the window as the plane began to taxi. The city lights below blurred with the stars above. And for the first time in his life, the sky didn't feel like escape. It felt like arrival. The ocean air felt different now. Brandon Cole stood barefoot on the shoreline of Santa Monica Pants, cuffed the water curling gently around his ankles, like it was trying to memorize him. The sky above stretched wide and clean, a quiet blue, without the weight of a mission or the echo of orders. For the first time in years, he wasn't calculating altitudes, wind speeds, or exit strategies. He was just there, present, alive. And finally, home. Behind him, laughter rang out from a small towel-covered patch of beach, where his 14-year-old son, Ben, sat building a driftwood fort every now and then, glancing over to make sure his father hadn't drifted too far. Brandon turned and gave him a small wave. The boy waved back, awkward, hesitant, but real. 2 days ago, they had barely known each other. Now, every exchanged glance, every half-smile, was part of something quietly miraculous. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But beginning. That morning, they had walked the Venice boardwalk together. Brandon wore sunglasses and a baseball cap low over his eyes, but every few blocks, someone would pause, recognize him, and nod respectfully. A veteran in a wheelchair saluted without a word. A waitress handed him coffee on the house, her fingers trembling slightly. Ben watched it all curious. You didn't tell me you were famous, the boy had said, trying to sound unimpressed. I'm not, Brandon replied, sipping his drink. I just showed up at the right time. Ben studied him for a moment. Mom used to say you were a ghost. Brandon looked out toward the horizon. She wasn't wrong. Now on the beach, Ben approached, slowly, hands in his hoodie pocket. Can I ask you something? Brandon turned. Anything. Ben hesitated. When that plane was falling, were you scared? Brandon knelt to the sand, his eyes soft. Yes, he said, without hesitation. But not for the reason you think. Ben tilted his head. Then what I was scared I'd never get another chance to meet you. The boy didn't say anything. He sat down beside his father and drew circles in the wet sand. Mom used to say you weren't dead, just lost. Brandon stared at the line of waves. She was right about that, too. Ben glanced at him. Are you still lost? Brandon paused. Not anymore. That evening back in Los Angeles, Brandon and Ben sat in the bleachers of a high school baseball field, long after the game had ended. The scoreboard was dark, the field lights still humming, casting long shadows across the empty bases. Brandon handed Ben a folded envelope. What's this? Your mom kept this, Brandon said. It was a letter I wrote when I first found out you were born. I never got to send it. Ben opened it carefully. His lips moved as he read. You don't know me yet, but I already love you more than anything I've ever flown toward or away from. One day, I'll tell you all the stories. But first, I want to be part of yours. Ben folded it slowly and tucked it into his jacket. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Ben leaned over and rested his head against Brandon's shoulder. For the first time, Brandon let his eyes close. 2 days later, Brandon received a call. The voice on the other end was sharp, direct. Pentagon clearance. Sir, we've finalized the motion. The Distinguished Flying Cross will be entered into the National Archives next to your original service record. You'll also be the first pilot in over 3 decades to have a flight simulator wing named after him. Brandon chuckled. I was never great with simulators. The voice paused. Then quieter. And yet you've become the real-life scenario every new cadet studies. He ended the call with polite thanks, but didn't linger. That night, he packed a small bag, kissed Ben on the forehead as the boy slept, and slipped out quietly. Not to disappear, but to finish something he had started long ago. At dawn, he arrived back at Edwards. Waiting on the runway was Diana Brooks, arms crossed, wind tugging at her coat. Beside her sat a restored fighter jet, a twin-seat F-15 Eagle. Sleek, familiar, reborn. I pulled some strings, she said with a smirk. Figured you owed the sky one last dance. Brandon ran his hand along the fuselage fingers, tracing the faint call sign newly painted under the cockpit, Ghost Rider. He turned to her. You flying back seat, she stepped forward. Someone has to keep you from stealing altitude. 20 minutes later, they climbed above the clouds. The sunrise hit them in full force, crimson and gold, lighting up the world from 30,000 feet. Brandon's hands rested lightly on the controls. Diana's voice crackled in his headset. How does it feel? He smiled beneath his oxygen mask. Like I never left. He banked, gently circling into the wind. The jet responded like it remembered him, like it had waited all these years just to carry him again. As they flew over the Mojave, Diana tapped the comms. There's one more thing. A second jet appeared from the east, then another, and another 6, total forming a perfect arrowhead around Brandon's F-15. Command Echo authorized a flight tribute, she said. For a son, the sky gave back. The formation tightened. Brandon didn't speak. He couldn't. His eyes stung with tears. As they soared across the desert in silence, the clouds parted to reveal the runways below, clean, clear, and endless. He wasn't flying to escape anymore. He was flying home. Hours later, the F-15 descended in quiet glory. Touchdown was smooth, perfect, the kind of landing that left no mark, just memory. As the jet rolled to a stop, Diana removed her helmet and turned to him. You good? Brandon looked out at the hangars, the sky, the earth, and nodded. I am. That night, back in Los Angeles, Brandon stood alone in Ben's room, watching his son sleep under a blanket covered in fighter jet prints. On the desk sat a hand-drawn picture, a plane in the sky trailing smoke, but still flying. Below it, in crooked handwriting, my dad is a real pilot. Brandon smiled, then quietly turned off the light, because in the end, the sky does not belong to the fearless. It belongs to the ones who fall and rise again, to those who disappear and choose to return, to the ghosts who become fathers, and the fathers who become legends. Where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to know where this story found you, whether it's a quiet town, a busy city, or somewhere in between. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to Soul Moment Story for more powerful, uplifting tales that honor courage, kindness, and second chances. And from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for spending your time with us today. Your presence means more than you know. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and keep believing in the quiet heroes around you.